Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. In this short video, I will demonstrate how to enable authentication method policy on Microsoft Entra Admin Center. For me, it's all about Azure Active Directory, Azure Infrastructure Configuration and Automation. Here you will know how to enable Fido2 key security, temporal access paths, and different hardware tokens. Now let's perform the demo to see how you can enable the different authentication policies on Microsoft Entra Admin Center. So right now here you go to the security, you click the security, you go to the authentication methods. We could see the different authentication methods that we have, which are additional layer of security for your employees or for your organization to protect their data. We have Fido2 security key, we have the Microsoft Authenticator app, and the temporal access paths. We have the email OTP, the hardware tokens, and the certificate-based authentication. You could see initially I already have my targets, which are all users enabled here on the Fido2 security keys. I will disable it and come back to start afresh. And also the certificate-based authentication on the all users which are enabled. I will disable all of them for us to see how it is done. Let's start with the Fido2 security key. If I click here, I'll click acknowledge, save. You could see right now, no user in the organization tenants can be able to configure Fido2 security key as an additional authentication method because none of them can do it because it is set to no. The same thing if I set this hardware token right now here and I set it to no and I acknowledge and save it. So they cannot perform these authentication methods. And as well, the certificate-based authentication, select it and acknowledge. And discard it. Let me see if anything already here. Acknowledge and save it. Yep. Now we've seen is only the email OTP that is enabled, meaning that your users or tenant members can only use email OTP as an additional multi-factor authentication method. So for Fido2 security key, if you don't know what Fido2 security key is, I already have a video on my channel explaining the configuration settings of Fido2 key security keys. So what I am doing right now is to show how you can enable Fido2 security key on Microsoft Entra Admin Center so that users or member tenants can be able to do the complete configuration on their devices. Okay, Fido2 key security key is a great phishing-resistant hardware for multi-factor authentication and is a passwordless authentication. With the Fido2 key security, which is like a USB, you don't need to remember any password. It generates your password through the configurations you've already performed by generating a certificate and linking the certificate to the Fido server so that anytime you want to sign in, you don't need to perform the configuration again. The only thing you put your Fido2 key on your device and immediately it reoccurs the initial configuration settings you have done. So let's see how you can enable it on your member tenants here. Here I'll click enable. You could see right now I've clicked enabled. You can decide to use all users on your organization member tenants, or you can decide to select group of users. It's always good to enable it for all users. Then if you want to exclude any particular user, you can or any particular group of users, you can as well add the user group. So here let's go to configure. Here, this is the basic settings, which is a great settings. You can decide to allow it as a self-service setup by clicking yes, enforce attestation, and also enforce key restriction policy. So on enforcing key restriction policy, you can decide to click yes. By enforce key restriction policy, It's all about if there's any particular key you don't want your users to use. This is when you enforce any particular key restrictions. Now, what is AA guide? By AA guide, this is a setting that is associated with the attestation of the key pair. So key pair is what is linked to FIDO authentication process. For instance, when a FIDO credential is created, it can be associated with an attestation key pair, and the AA guide helps identify the specific attestation key pair used during the attestation process. So this ensures that the attestation process is secure and trustworthy, whereby allowing relying parties such as servers or service authentication users to verify that the attestation was performed using a known and trusted attestation root key. So the key pair is a strong instrument in Fido2 authentication. So right now, I don't want to enforce any key restrictions. I would say keep it no and click save. Now we could see that I've enforced Fido2 security key settings policy for all users in the organization tenants. I'll perform a few policies here. This is temporary access pass settings. So what is temporary access pass settings? So it's a time limited or limited use passcode that you can set so that users to be able to have a limited time in enforcing multi-factor authentication. It gives users a particular time frame whereby they have to implement this multi-factor authentication by allowing them to bypass, you understand, multi-factor authentication within a particular time limit. The same way you can enable it for all users here, and the configuration comes in here. You could see I already have a general configuration here. Now let's see how I can edit it. On the temporary access pass settings, you can edit it based on the minutes, hours, days, and it has both minimum lifetime and maximum lifetime. So what does this mean? You have to be very careful because your minimum lifetime cannot be higher than your maximum lifetime. That is just a basic logic. So here I can decide to increase this 2 hours, and I can decide to increase this 2 hours. Like the default lifetime, I can decide to increase maybe the maximum lifetime to 9 days. And also you have to be very careful about the length characters. You cannot give any length character that is less than 8. If I put 5 now, it will tell me that the value must be at least 8. Then I can put the value as 10, or I can put the value as 8. So the last thing you have to see here is it requires one-time use. So if you decide to say, okay, yes, after one-time use, not anymore, you can click yes. Or if you want like yes, one-time use, you can click no. Okay, we can keep it yes and see what happens. Now we have updated it. We have 2 hours, the minimum lifetime. We have default lifetime 2 hours, and we have length of 8 characters. And we click save. So now we have enabled temporary access pass. Let's go to hardware tokens. So the same thing, you enable the hardware tokens, which is very easy. You can exclude or add groups on the hardware tokens. So it's also the same thing, a standard secret key that generates 6-digit key codes that is being used in authentication. It's more of like a physical device that enables one-time passcode. I will click save. And that is it. Further, you can do I've already done the email OTP, voice call OTP, and the last one I will do here is a certificate-based authentication. So the certificate-based authentication is more of generating a certificate using it's more of generating a certificate, okay, that uses the X.509 certificates especially working on the public key infrastructure. If you don't understand much about the certificate-based authentication, I have a channel that's I talked about every configuration and every aspect of certificate-based authentication for you to have a wide view and bigger picture on certificate-based authentication. What I'm doing here is just how to show how you can enable all these authentication settings and policies on Microsoft Entra Admin Center so that any users who want to use any type of this authentication policy can be able to use it. It's also important to know that all these authentication methods, the only person who can implement these authentication methods and enable it, it must be a global administrator or a user administrator. So on the configuration of the certificate-based token, we could see it has a lot of configurations here. Right here. Okay, I have not enabled it first. Yes, you enable it. Now, if I do configure, you could see a different changes. It has a protection layer, which also has an authentication binding that determines the strength of your certificate-based authentication policy. Definitely, a single-factor authentication protection layer cannot be stronger than a multi-factor authentication. So it is always advised as a best practice to use multi-factor authentication binding policy. And also to always set your affinity binding to high. From here, you can also add different certification issuer. So this certification-based authentication works with the public key infrastructure. And also, it is also linked to Fido2 security keys. These are how all these authentication settings and policies works together. Now, if you click add rule, here you can add different certificate attribute policy rules. You can decide to add the certificate issuer. If, for instance, you are using a particular vendor certificate, this is where you add it, whereby you have a license to add it. And here you can decide to add your level of authentication strength. You can also decide to add your affinity binding, which I've already added. Also, you can decide to choose your policy OID, and you enter your OID policy. So if I have my OID policy right now, that's what I will enter, because this is very well attached to your organization. So entering policy ID, it has to be related to the certificate-based authentication that you are using for your public key infrastructure. Another good area to know is adding your username binding. So using the username binding, by selecting it, you must select one of the X.509 certificate fields to bind as one of your user attributes in the cloud. So for instance, I already have certificate field affinity bindings and also user attributes here. You can, here I will delete one and let's see how we put it. You see down, I've deleted one. Let's see how I can add the rule. On the certificate field, we have the high affinity and we have the SKI, we have the SHA-I public key. I can decide to select this and let me select the user attributes. I'll select the certificate user attributes and add. You see, I've already added it, which the affinity binding is very high. Let me select another username binding rule, SKI, and add it. You could see now the affinity binding is also very high. I acknowledge it and save. And all users can be able now to implement certificate-based authentication on their devices and sign-ins, protecting their devices and also organizations protecting their data against any phishing attack or against any loss, against SQL injections. This is really a basic way to implement and to enable different Microsoft Entra admin authentication policies so that to safeguard organization data, and also to give your users a great user experience anytime they are signing in on their devices. I hope you've already seen how easily, as maybe as a support desk, help desk administrator, or system administrator, you can be able to perform different authentication policies using Microsoft Entra Admin Center. It's all about Microsoft Entra Admin. It's all about Azure Active Directory. It's all about passwordless authentication, and it's all about protecting users and protecting organization data against any unauthorized usage or against any authorized attack. I have several videos and channels I've done on different usage of Microsoft Entra Admin and Azure Active Directory. Please take your time, watch, subscribe, and like my videos, like my channel. Thank you so much for having the time to learn something and knowing how to configure this. Thank you, and